everyone. Welcome to Gaming Mechanics. I'm Mark, and this is a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, why they work, and why we love them. And today, as always, I have with me Greg.
Yep.
And we actually have a special guest, Xander.
Hey, everybody.
And he's joining us as one of the people playing Left 4 Dead with me and Greg. And we just wanted to invite him along to share his experience.
Greg and I, you uncultured donkey.
All right, from now on, we'll actually just have a transcript
it's just-
that Greg edits the grammar of.
Next week,
But,
just Xander
anyway.
and Mark.
Yeah, right. Something horrible happened to
Yeah,
Greg.
right.
He came down with a terrible illness.
There he is.
Xander, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I've known Mark and Greg for a few years now. We went to college together. I've been playing games my whole life and enjoy hanging out with Mark and Greg and talking about games too. And I'm a big fan of the podcast too, guys.
We have a big fan. Anyway, it's also maybe worth noting that we live, like, Xander and I live together, and he's like 5 feet away in his room. And so
Yes.
a little bit of nepotism
Good.
coming into the podcast. If you guys want to get on it, then,
Just live with us.
find Mark or I.
This is actually a desperate plea for roommates.
Yeah. That's what it's about. Yeah.
Anyway, so today we're going to talk about Left 4 Dead to start with, Left 4 Dead 2 specifically. But then we're going to branch out a little bit more into talking about AI in games. For those of you who don't know, Left 4 Dead 2 is a post-apocalyptic zombie slayer game. It kind of fits squarely between survival horror and action in terms of gaming genre. And as you play through the levels, you are constantly bombarded with waves of zombies. There's plenty of zombies that just sort of stand around in the environment, but they also frequently come at you, and you've got to be on your toes to deal with incoming hordes and different special zombies that have different powers. And it's a first-person shooter, so you're collecting ammo and weapons and going around trying to make your way through these levels. Generally, it's a pretty linear progression from the beginning of the level. You're just trying to get to the safe zone at the end, and you're trying to survive while that's happening, while you're constantly being bombarded. So I wanted to start with let's talk about what is it like to play this game, and what are some things you enjoy about the experience.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the reason we decided to do this was because we'd picked it up on Steam during the summer sale for like $2, and then we're playing together, and we've all played a lot of different games, and I really can't remember the last time I had as much fun in a cooperative gameplay sense than the nights that we get together and play Left 4 Dead and turn off all the lights. And it brings me back to younger, more innocent days of gaming, where that was kind of the primary that was the primary way I played games, as opposed to online.
Yeah, I feel like this entire genre of getting 4 people together for a co-op game where there's no competitive against each
Yeah.
other is not as common anymore.
For sure.
It's a fun experience to go back to.
Totally. But yeah, so one thing that, at least for me, that kept on coming up was just how fun the experience was of, one, losing and wiping on the map and having to try again. No, but just basically how well the fantasy of being a small group of people in a post-apocalyptic world trying to survive zombies felt. And how well the game realized that fantasy, how the different set pieces, the desperation that comes through, the fact that you usually barely make it to the end on your last legs in terms of resources and ammo and health and all that jazz, and just how well it felt. It didn't feel like just a zombie shoot 'em up in a lot of regards. It felt very much like this well put in terms of the straddling of like survival horror and action. So I think that was what most stuck out to me, especially with some other games I've been playing as of late that didn't maybe do that as well. Xander, what stood out to you?
Yeah, so I think one of the I agree with a lot of the points you made about the game. One of the things that I just think stood out to me a lot was the basically just the requirement for you to communicate and play together.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of games where you're kind of just fending off the waves, you can kind of until someone goes down. I think specifically of I played a lot of Uncharted 3, and there's some arena type modes in that game where you just fight off waves, and until someone goes down and you have to revive them, you don't really need to talk to each other. You can just kind of kill the onslaught.
Right.
But with Left
Right.
4 Dead and the special zombies, you're not necessarily down. You're just like taken out by a charger or a smoker or something like that, and you need your teammate to come rescue you,
Right.
and that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really cool aspect of the game too, that stood out to me the most was like how much it actually does require teamwork and this like chaotic frenzy of like zombies. You have to be listening for each other and looking out for each other while you play.
Yeah, totally. No, that's really
That's a great point. For those who don't know, there's a few different zombies, four in specific, that will completely incapacitate your character, where you actually are required to get help from your teammates. Otherwise, you will die.
Charger, Smoker, Jockey, and Hunter.
Yeah. So you do have to work together. Like you literally couldn't make it through the level just yourself. Even if you choose to play solo, you'll get AI people, AI companions to fight with you because the zombie would incapacitate you and you'd die.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great point, Xander, that it forces you to communicate with and work with and stay by
And
your
keep
team.
track of. That's one thing that even we have had a hard time with.
That's true.
Elite gamers that we are.
It's amazing.
Yeah. But anyway, so one of the big parts of the game, or one of the large mechanics that brings, I think, a lot of these things to life, is kind of the semi-unique system. Mark knows more about this than either of us, but you want to tell us a little bit about the game director, the way that the game decides what's going to happen, the fact that it's not all scripted, it's actually entirely procedurally generated, each map.
Yeah, yeah. It's so Left 4 Dead came out. The original one came out in 2008, and the director was quite an innovation for Left 4 Dead. There's probably precedent in other games, but this was the first time it was used in a big way to really run the entire game. One of the things all three of us were impressed by playing the game was the feeling of desperation and this idea of it really makes you feel like you're on your last leg trying to survive, which is tough to always have players be at that point because you think eventually you would just die.
Right.
What the AI director does is it is the thing that constantly spawns in waves of zombies. You heard me talk earlier about how you have these waves that come at you. And it actually literally has a timer that counts down and will spawn zombies just out of your view to come at the players. You'll notice if you've played Left 4 Dead, the levels are a little too wide. So I said it was linear, and it is. You've got a pretty clear pathway that runs from the beginning of the level to the end, but you've got all these rooms off to the side. And it makes for fun exploring, but most of them are dead ends in a way that might feel a little bit weird if you're used to pretty linear games. Like, why is this room is just a little bit deeper and there's a few more doors than I would expect. And the reason for that is it's giving the director places to put zombies that are always close to your party, so that at any point in time it could swarm you with very little notice. Because if you're being swarmed by zombies and you see them coming like a mile off, that does happen at times, but it's less scary. If you're in an enclosed area, you want to be able, as a level designer, for the director to put zombies near the player so that they can attack the players. And what the AI is trying to do, actually, it literally has an approximate stress score for each player. And it is trying to get the players to feel stressed. And so that's why Left 4 Dead and Left 4 Dead 2, which there was a few changes to the director, but it's mostly the same system. That's why it does such a good job at giving you this feeling of desperation and like, as soon as I catch my breath, there's a hunter on me. As soon as I use this health pack and get to full health, now I got a spitter who just took me down to half health. And the director does keep track of these things. And if you look at estimated stress levels in the game, they reset to 0 in about 15 seconds. So that's about as much of a breather as the director's really comfortable with for players.
Whoa, I didn't know that. That's about right, actually. That's cool. They're like, no, 15 seconds is enough for them. Like that's enough time for them to not be stressed. I mean, if you think about it, like, and we'll kind of touch on this a little bit later, but it's like, also, what's the goal of the game, right? Like, do you literally want a game? I mean, if this worked too well and it was just like perpetual stress for the player, not many people would probably come back to this. There's obviously something very, very fulfilling outside of just feeling terrified all the time. It's not just a stress simulator. It's a game that you're supposed to be able to overcome and beat. So the tuning there, I don't know specifically how they managed that, but being able to keep you feel under anxiety and stressed and kind of you're at your last leg. Like literally every time we finish a map, we all like breathe a sigh of relief, like literally in the comms.
Yeah, like we made
Like,
it.
oh my god. So that's really interesting. I don't know how the developers towed that line. If they did a lot of play testing, if it just kind of came out that way naturally, they found a great system. But the other thing I was thinking was another upside to that is that procedural generation of enemies and conflict basically also gets you to the point where a lot of times, especially on the harder maps, we'll have to replay it multiple times, right? And we'll go down. And one thing that's great is one, you can't memorize the map. You can memorize the layout, but even in terms of the way that they give you resources, that changes as well. But two, it's cool because like it's not kind of binary, right? Where you either will absolutely stomp the map or just get entirely overwhelmed. There's some level of adaptation. Very rarely will we get kind of caught in something as a team where we all immediately just get wiped, right? There's usually some semblance of, hey, even if we pull this off well enough, we might, like, one of us or two of us might go down, and then the AI and the third person might be able to pull through and revive us. Like it tends to be more kind of on a spectrum of like we're getting stuck in this one area, and maybe we get stuck a little bit too long, and then things start to go south. Like, and similarly, we tend to maybe there are some maps, but in general, I don't think we tend to just absolutely just railroad a map. Where it's just kind of this nonstop advance through the whole thing. Then we hit the safe room, and it's like, okay, well that was fun. So I think it's another great like fantasy-inducing or enhancing rather dynamic of that. Outside of just kind of that desperation, it also makes it feel not as much like a game in terms of like where you can kind of it keeps you in the game as opposed to like making you abstract it out and be like, okay, here's what we have to do to beat the game.
Right, it prevents
Yeah.
you from feeling like you just have a system you figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And on that point too, like when you're playing like a level or a piece of a level like over and over
Mhm.
again, you don't get frustrated continually with the same point because like you were saying, Greg,
Oh, that's
like
a good point.
the AI sends baddies and specials at different points or completely different specials. So you're not like, oh man, here's the charger part again where we're gonna lose. It's like, no, there might not be a charger
Right.
here and it will come later. And so you're
Right.
not frustrated because you're not dying at the same point. You might die in the same chapter a bunch of times, but you're like getting at different points in different places, so it gives you more energy to like try again because it was different. It felt
Yeah,
different.
totally. That's a really good point. Like even if you die the exact same amount of times, just not literally dying on the same enemy every time would reduce the amount of like fatigue.
Yeah, it's not like Halo where it's like, okay, this is the room with hunters where we always
Yeah.
die. Let's try
Or
it
like Dark
again.
Souls, right? Like going into the one room either with a boss or a mini boss where it's just you can't. It's the exact same thing over and over. And that's a different type. And I guess we could transition to that a little bit in terms of AI and the experience that the Dark Souls crafts, which is the intended experience of that game, which is the same thing over and over, and this is a very nearly insurmountable challenge, and you will play it until you figure it out, and then you'll win, and then you'll do it again for 40 hours.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty much is the game. Well, one thing I want to talk about with Left 4 Dead before we leave that topic and go into AI generally. I mentioned the director. Yeah, it keeps track of stress levels. Those reset after about 15 seconds. The waves are usually about 2 minutes apart. So although you might be sitting at low stress for a while, it will just kind of prepare a next wave for you. And it kind of acts like the best analogy I can come up with is like a non-Newtonian fluid. Like the harder you try
That's
to
the
press
best.
through it.
That's the best analogy you can come up with.
That's the best one I can come up with. So I don't want to take too long explaining
Yeah,
non-Newtonian
there we go.
fluids.
That's kind of the danger there.
But if you, but okay, so the faster I guess maybe more like maybe wind resistance is a better
There we
one.
go.
But like the faster you try to go through the level, the more the director
It pushes
push
back,
back
yeah.
at you, and so it tries to force a certain pacing through the level. So you can go too fast, and it will fight you on that. And if you start going too slow, it will just bombard you till you die.
Yeah.
And so you will start to realize like if we just sit here and take our time looting this room, like we're all gonna die.
Yeah, and we've definitely experienced that.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
happened to us a lot of
that's
times.
But the reverse has happened too, like where we just like ran ahead, or like one or two people
Yeah.
ran ahead, and then they both got hunted, and then everybody
and
died.
yeah, that's a full wipe.
but I also wanted to talk about the contrast between you've got the super smart director AI, which is keeping track of everything. It even has estimates of player stress levels. It knows where it can spawn things, and it knows where certain cinematic regions are, so it's not going to do anything crazy around
Right.
that. And then you've also got these really dumb zombie AIs that literally just walk at you. Like
Hmm.
that's as complicated as the AI
Yep.
is. With everything other than like witches, and then I don't know if boomers have maybe a slightly more complex
Seems
AI,
like it.
but most of the zombies just find their target and attack you. And so you've got this major contrast between these super dumb AI and then this pretty smart AI in the
Hmm.
background
That's
controlling
interesting.
them.
Yeah.
I think that could be set the stage for talking about what's the purpose of these different AIs in a game. And like what you were mentioning, Greg, like you've got in Dark Souls, you've got these complicated AI, but they're pretty
Yeah.
rigid in terms of what they do, where they go, where you're going to run into
Mhm.
them, things like
They're very
that.
manipulatable. They will respond very very normally like repetitively to the same thing over and over. That being said, they're stupidly difficult to deal with when you get there, right? Like it's interesting because even as you were talking, Mark, I was thinking about Left 4 Dead, and you don't feel like you're playing against the game director, right? Most people don't even probably know it exists. You feel
Right.
like you're playing against the zombies, but and those are all pretty darn simple. Even the AI, the specific AI of some of the big specials, like the tank, which is kind of a mini boss sort of thing. That's not. That's
Hmm.
not. I mean, they're all. I mean, they pretty much will run towards the nearest thing or attack the nearest thing. Um,
Hmm.
Right.
and yeah, strategically, like you have this larger kind of puppet master that makes it more interesting. So with Dark Souls, you have, obviously that's all purely scripted. None of that's procedural. But you have an AI on the ground that again is not too the cleverness of a lot of AI in Dark Souls, in my opinion, isn't the AI even itself. It's the way that it like the creators put different things in, right? Like times like you'll walk through a door, right, and you'll just get broadsided by something. Like
Hmm.
things that keep you on your toes aren't necessarily like the way that the AI acts to you. And this, to be fair, I've only actually ever played Dark Souls 1 for any amount of time. I haven't played 2 or 3, so I don't know if that improved, but it seems like more the key gameplay mechanic there is figuring out their attack patterns, their animations, timings, weaknesses, yada yada yada, and really mechanically beating them as opposed to strategically.
Yeah, and I mean one of the other things too that's really important about like the distinction between a game like Dark Souls and a game like Left 4 Dead in terms of AI is that in Dark Souls you're actually fighting more of like individual enemies or maybe like,
Yeah, sure.
four or five at a
Yep.
time. And so you're actually the AI for the specific enemies has to be like
Yep.
interesting. As opposed to in Left 4 Dead, you don't actually have to worry about how interesting like a zombie attacks you
Yep.
because there's 50 of them and you don't care. You just need to get them off of
Totally.
you.
Right.
And so there's a difference there too of like what the game needs the AI to even
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. Totally.
Um,
And no, that's a really good point.
Yeah, it would nobody would first you wouldn't appreciate it, but also like
Yeah.
it
Right.
wouldn't really matter if every zombie had a slightly different flair to
Yeah.
it.
Right.
Like
In
people
a
are
way.
they're just not going to
Yeah. Totally.
notice.
Yeah.
Like
mhm.
it just in terms of bang for your buck as a developer, that's not where you want to invest
Yeah.
your time. And I think it's brilliant for them to sort of abstract out the
Yeah.
intelligence and make it sort of this super entity. It's kind of like the zombies have a hive
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
Like the way that they program the game is it functions more like
No,
that,
very
and it's
much
pretty
actually.
cool.
Huh. That's cool. There could be even some in-game rationale behind why it happens the way it does. Maybe that's the last mission where we have to find like the zombie hive. That would be. It's not, but that would be cool.
That would be really. I don't
No,
think it
yeah,
is, but that
That's
would
definitely
be
not.
interesting.
cool. I was gonna say I haven't heard of any Left 4 Dead lore
Yeah, I
along
know.
those
Yeah, it would
lines.
be a little bit too much.
Yeah.
I was thinking about just AI in general and how Left 4 Dead does such a good job, particularly its game director, at not only just one being fun, but two like really making kind of experiencing that fantasy of four ragtag survivors. And so then I was trying to think about AI that didn't do that and kind of did the opposite, actually, in
Hmm.
games systems. And one of the first things I think of was stealth games, right, which are really really hard to do. But like think about like early Metal Gear Solid, or even just the original Metal Gear series, which are some of the seminal works of stealth games back then,
Right.
um, and and the classic, just how easy it is, right, to deceive guards in general. Where you can pop out from around a corner, they'll see you, and then duck into another room and wait for their timer to kind of decrease, and then they'll go back to patrolling the exact same place as if nothing had ever happened, right?
Right.
Or even I haven't played too much Metal Gear. I just know about it, but or the classic, like alerting someone, going around a corner, they follow, and then you like jump under a box, and they immediately are like, no one has ever been here or existed. Like this is entirely erased from my mind. So like that sort of thing is very not conducive to making you feel like this elite super spy, right? Because instead of obviously it makes it very easy, and in that regard you can at least feel like powerful in a way, but you don't actually feel stealthy. You feel like you're working a game, and
Right.
and then similarly, what I do have a little bit more experience in, and that is a lot better, but still has its flaws. The Batman Arkham series of games, which are fantastic, and one of the big huge things, and even people talk about when they first play it, is like, oh my gosh, it makes you feel like you're Batman, and it's one of the first games that really did that. And it really does, and a big part of that is of course feeling like this kind of predator in the night, in the darkness and the shadows, getting to terrify your enemies and pick them off one by one, that sort of thing. And of course, the game does a
Mm-hmm.
fantastic job of that. But there's some level that there's so many systems in that game, that the stealth aspect isn't fantastic. It's very similar again, where you can, even one of the big mechanics is you can hide on. There's most rooms, big kind of stealth rooms, will have gargoyles or perches up amongst the room. And those are safe zones, basically. If you get up to one of those, they can't see you or attack you up there, which again is kind of ludicrous when you think about it. If you were to try to
Right. The idea of a spy having a safe zone.
exactly, or just like think about a movie trying to shoot that scene, and Batman's fighting, and he gets maybe another guy shows up, and he zips away, and then he's just like sitting on a pillar like 30 feet up, and the bad guys are immediately befuddled. Like,
Right.
like
Where'd he go?
it's not the way that works. So that was an interesting contrast, at least thinking about that. But then, Mark, what was your response?
I think stealth games are sort of classically hard to do good AI for, and the reason is because the puzzle you're really presenting the player with is how do I break into this facility or sort of disable all the enemies without really people being alerted to my presence. And you want to present a forgiving and sort of consistent experience for the player. In the real world, like, yeah, as soon as Batman shows up at the facility, like, if one dude gets out like a radio call, the whole place is on
Right,
lockdown.
exactly.
Like, you're not going to get in and attack the Joker because he's going to be in some like sealed room and it's just going to be game over.
Right.
Like, so it has to be somewhat forgiving. And I think that games can get away with this. The problem is stealth games are notoriously human.
Right.
There aren't a lot of like non-human stealth
Right.
games. In fact, there's none coming to mind, but there's a lot of indie games, so it probably exists.
Yeah, yeah, we've reached that critical mass in gaming right now, where like it's kind of the if you can think of it, probably there isn't any developer who
Right.
managed
Somebody's
to get it
done
out
like
there.
a dog stealth game or something. But
Yeah. The-
but because what you're
I would play the
modeling,
crap out of that. I don't know. I mean, there's Goat Simulator, so that's one step removed. Just add like a stealth mechanic and change the skin of the goat to a dog, and we're like basically there.
goat stealth, goat gear solid,
yeah.
metal goat
Metal
solid.
Goat Salad.
Uh, but so in Left 4 Dead, for example, what the AI is modeling or what the AI lives in is a zombie. Well, that's what the player interacts with, and so it's okay if they seem kind of stupid because they're
It's
zombies.
reasonable.
And in other games, if it's like a little like animated Goomba or something, it's not too hard to believe that it has a pretty normal way of doing things that is rigid and not that flexible. Humans, on the other hand, we've got a lot more experience with how they think and how they respond, and so it makes the abstraction of you being Batman in this game seem less realistic when the people respond to like not
Right.
people. They respond like a Goomba. They respond like something much less intelligent. And so it takes you out of the experience of being Batman fighting real humans to try to get to the Joker.
Right. Exactly. But so there's that end of it, of course, which is like completely necessary because you don't actually want to be fighting against real humans, right? Like that's not the point of the game.
Right, and we've talked about that before. Like in like League, where you don't want the minions to be player controlled.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that would not be fun.
Yeah, and one other point on this like idea of like stealth is that basically like you don't as like a designer, you want players to play your game in a certain way, typically.
Right.
And so like if you're designing a stealth game, you want them to play it stealthily. And if stealth is too frustrating and too hard because your AI is too smart and you alert one guy and it's
Right.
over, then
Right.
players are just going to play it like a shoot 'em up, or
Right. They'll try to
they
break
won't do
through
the
the stealth
stealth part.
area. Yeah.
And so that's like I think when I think of like games that like kind of toe that line is like The Last of Us. You can
Sure.
enter places really stealthily, but once you kind of like if the stealth gets too difficult or too hard, then players will actually kind of not play the game how I, at least in my opinion, I assumed it was to be played, which is like stealthily and taking guys out
Right.
discreetly. They'll just kind of lower the difficulty of the game and just blow through
Yep.
people, like running in like one man taking on hundreds or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
And so you have to like walk that line of like making stealth enjoyable enough that players will actually do it. And if it's too hard, then they won't. They'll just find other ways to play the game.
Totally. Well, especially when you have so many different mechanics to utilize, right? Like in kind of these hybrid games where, like Batman or Shadow of Mordor being another example, or Last of Us, all have options for stealth and stealth areas, as well as really deep and robust combat systems, and trying to find the line between those. But no, I totally know what you mean. That's a good point of trying to, actually achieve what the game's trying to achieve, as opposed to and just straight up, like steamrolling you. Which is, again, kind of come back to Left 4 Dead. Part of the elegance of the ad director is that that's pretty hard to have happen, actually,
Yeah.
because it's not set.
Yeah, because of the way that the waves are set up, like you usually don't get steamrolled. Usually it's more like an erosion over
Exactly.
time, where
Yeah.
it's like, oh, we probably won't make it through the next like three
Right.
waves.
So that led our discussion to another interesting place, which was like, what? This is a little bit philosophical here. We don't have to stay here too long, but like, what is the goal then for AI? Like, is it supposed to be? I mean, I guess it's up to each developer, right? In terms of what you want your player to be experiencing. But is the goal kind of straight fantasy? Is the goal just enough challenge to make the player feel powerful? Is it to really accurately portray the things that it's trying to portray? Like what? Because that made us talk about Skyrim, right? Like how easy it is to rob everyone blind in Skyrim, and how
Yeah, it's like a basket. over
exactly
your head.
like you're basically a sociopath walking around this place, but people don't treat you that way because that wouldn't be fun, right? Like if you
Right.
spend like 40 hours just messing with everyone across the whole country, you're going to get a reputation. There's going to be like wanted posters. No one's going to trust you. No one's going to talk to you. You'll just be this weird guy at the edge of society, and that's like no one wants to play that.
Yeah. Like there's definitely a difference between like Metal Gear Solid and like espionage simulator.
Right? Yeah.
Like they do not play the same, and the developers would want to make them very different. You need to think about, like, I think originally when AI was being developed, really you had to throw in some of these predictability and these gimmicks because that was the best they could do. I mean, the AI was not very complicated. It was probably a few hundred lines of code. And now you could make AI that was, I mean, strategically it's not going to play better than a human, but certainly could like hunt you down, and if there's like 30 of them, they'll kill
Oh,
you.
yeah, totally.
Like, no matter how good you are. And of course that's not going to be fun. And so they're reaching a point in game development where they need to decide what the limits are on the AI. But it does, it creates this question of like, well, what's the point of AI if it's not simulation in a game?
Yeah, because we're not playing simulators actually. Like no one would actually want to play a real post-apocalyptic simulator, right? Like that sounds horrible. Actually, that's
You
trauma.
got dysentery.
Yeah.
It would be like the Oregon
Kind
Trail.
of, yeah, exactly. Or like true Batman, right? Because he'll probably end up getting shot. There's a reason that Batman doesn't actually exist in the real world, right? Like it's because that's not
Right.
entirely possible. Hence, a real Batman simulator would kind of suck.
Right.
So yeah, that line between that's interesting. The line between simulation and fantasy versus like the actually simulating the experience. That's gonna be hard, man.
And I
Game
think-
developing sounds hard.
I think realistic games have a harder time with it,
Yeah.
and that's why I brought up like the human factor in Metal Gear Solid, because you can do like weird sort of predictable AI in a game that's sort of like Yoshi or Mario or these Nintendo franchises really easily, because there's not the expectation of the player that I'm in a simulation.
Right.
And I think games that try to be more realistic set themselves up to seem more like simulations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Or at least it's a lot easier for the player to go to that place, right? To begin thinking in that term.
Right, and then when it's not, it feels jarring.
Difference between player unknown versus
Right.
Overwatch, which is our favorite comparison apparently,
As of
Mhm.
last episode.
as of a week ago.
Xander, you had some interesting points about like the AI in Smash and how it might relate to this, like a human versus a normal AI.
Yeah, totally. So, one of the games that I really enjoy playing is Super Smash Bros. And one of the things that like I remember as a kid was like setting the computer up to level 9, and that being like the biggest challenge you
Right.
could ever
Right.
do is like beat like a level 9 computer.
Apocalyptic, like.
Um, yeah, exactly. And so, but what's really interesting and what, as I've gotten more into like watching the competitive scene and more in like the Smash community, is that computers are actually like not that good and not that good to practice against. And it's true for a couple reasons. One is I think eventually I think we all got to the point where we could beat like a level 9, like it wasn't impossible. But the thing is that the problems with the AI in Smash was that they didn't have amazing strategy. They had amazing mechanical skill. And this is not actually indicative of like what humans are like. So like a level 9 computer in Melee might have perfect like power shielding or perfect like spot dodges or things like that that no human could ever have. And so when you play against computers and you were to like, if you were to just like train against them, you wouldn't actually be optimizing for a realistic experience. And so it's actually not it's considered like not as productive to play against like computer AI to like try to be competitive because they don't act close enough to humans, and you're like playing, you're training yourself against like unrealistic environments,
I mean,
basically.
it'd be the equivalent of like playing against aimbots in Overwatch and practicing that way, where they're like perfect mechanically, and you would get better at something. You'd get a lot better at predicting spot dodges or learning how to compensate for perfect power shields. But if that's not what you're actually going to be going against in competitive play, then that's actually a useless gesture.
Yeah, exactly. Your time could be better spent learning like, yeah, how players set traps
Right.
and things like that, that computers just, especially when Melee was made in 2001, are like not,
God, that was
the AI was
2001.
nowhere near doing something like that. So
Man,
yes, it
What?
was.
we're,
The GameCube was
we're
out then?
old.
Oh my
Rip,
god.
rip, Xander Kragenmark.
Yeah, rip youth.
Uh, yeah, because a lot of what you're dealing
Wow.
with in AI that it basically is cheating. Like it's subhuman reaction time, right? Like the power shielding. Like there is a threshold on the limit to human response times, and computers can blow through that. There is an amount of time that humans need to react to a stimulus, and computers don't have that limit. And so a lot of what you're learning to deal
Right.
with are people who are unrealistically responsive to things happening on screen. And that's not going to help you when you play people and they're normally responsive because you've spent all
Right.
this time trying to compensate for
Mhm.
something you're not going to be dealing with.
I mean, the other thing got me thinking too is like kind of going back to our earlier discussions slash kind of one of the bedrocks of what we talk about here, but the metagame that develops in a game, which is you computers can't or AI don't develop to that, right? They don't adapt to things that change in the way the game is played. So having obviously having when you talk about strategy, that's why it's so difficult for them. Where they AI and Melee don't wave dash, right? They don't know how to do that or how
Mhm.
to utilize that or matchups. My guess is they don't. I don't know how that works, but my guess is that there's not specific matchups. For every combination of character in there, they just wrote AI for the character and playing well for that character, as opposed to
Right.
um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
how you'd play differently versus Marth or Fox. Um,
Mhm.
and similarly, like I was just thinking, like similarly, right? There's my if I have any expertise, quote unquote, in games, would be something resembling RTSs. I've played probably the most of those. Similarly, it's really difficult to program strategy into RTS games. Again, you can play, you can obviously bring their mechanical proficiency up to 100% in terms of the perfect thing would be like econ management, right? Where all of your queues line up perfectly, all of your you're playing at complete max capacity with your economy in terms of the way you're gathering
Mm-hmm.
resources and expanding that system. That will continue to replicate, and that's a huge part of. I mean, StarCraft 2, for example, is like largely macro based. If you out macro your opponent, it doesn't matter um, how well they micro to an extent, right?
Right.
In a battle, if you just have more stuff will win
Mm-hmm.
every time. So anyway, so you can make an AI that has perfect macro, or in certain circumstances, right, perfect ability usage or kind of simple micro stuff. But if you six pool them, which is a strategy in StarCraft that's kind of cheap, which is just a really really quick rush with a race that's really good at rushing. If you utilize this kind of cheese, this piece of strategy that got developed, that you'll win every time. You can beat a brutal AI by six pooling like pretty much every time. But basically, kind of the same thing, right? Across the board, either with if it's Smash or RTS or kind of competitive games. Anytime there's human meta being developed on the outside, which is like the ability to think and reason and strategize, AI is not going to be able to keep up with that.
Yeah, I think
You'd have
that's
to write a
that's a
new
great
AI every
point.
time, right?
Which would actually be really interesting if a game got to the point where they were like their patches included like AI
Yeah,
buffs
right.
and things like that to like actually
To
make
compensate.
play better. It'd be really interesting to see.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to see a game that really put their AI first instead of the like multiplayer modes first.
Right.
And I think that that's generally where the effort goes into is like trying to make sure the multiplayer is balanced. And,
Oh,
and
totally.
and I think that right now like that's totally the right thing to be doing. But just out of like
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
out of curiosity's sake, I want to know what would it be like if a game studio decided we're gonna have the best AI experience, and if there are
Yeah.
things unbalanced in the AI, we're gonna fix that over things that are unbalanced in the multiplayer.
Yeah, I mean, and something like that could be done for a game like Left 4 Dead, even where like if there's just like a well-known like this is how you get around like this kind of like zombie AI or something like that, I could see them making a patch to like make the game reduce like get rid of those kind of like cheats or whatever.
If it doesn't play right. And I love the point that
Mhm.
you made, Greg, about how AI really can't take advantage of these more advanced emergent mechanics, like wave
Right.
bashing. Like,
Right.
if the players discover something truly like interesting and really game changing, the AI isn't going to know about that unless you
Yeah.
have some way to update the AI over the air, which doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not a place that studios are spending resources post release
Mhm.
in any game. But that's interesting too to think about, like think about trying to balance it, because even when you're talking about Left 4 Dead, right? Like, say that we decide, there's something that's not playing right. And as a developer, you can either you can tweak, and normally what most developers have to do in a multiplayer sense is the only thing you can tweak is the game itself, the game mechanics, right? Like, say the grenade launcher is too overpowered, and so we change the amount of ammo it has. We have change the spread on the damage, the absolute damage, whatever, and try to change that. Or in this case, though, like this is a fun thought experiment. Um, in Because like in a multiplayer game, developers can't balance the people playing, right? Like
Right.
they can't change one of the actors in the game. That's the one chaotic thing. They can change what they interact with, but they can't change that. And in like Left 4 Dead, you could change the AI though and the way it thinks. So you can actually
Right.
change one of the. It's not just changing like tweaking numbers or mechanics here, but it's actually changing the way that the AI thinks. So instead of like, then the question becomes not like, hey, what's too easy about this? What tool is the player using? It's too good. It's what's making the encounter not work correctly, and how can we make the AI think better about that? So they can
Yeah.
use the same exact tools, and it'll still be more difficult.
Yeah, you can just
Um,
increase the proficiency with those tools instead of
right,
having
exactly.
to, lower the blaster damage or whatever they would have to do in a
Yeah, totally.
game with just multiplayer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Again, something that would absolutely never happen because no one is asking for this. Which
We're
is a
asking
common
for it,
theme on
Greg.
this podcast, I think. What if there's a game maker simulator and you compete with an AI that has to make another game, and then you like move it to market, and you have to like manage your like the family life of your programmers and
Okay, wait, that might actually be a thing. I'm not.
dang it, we really are at critical mass here. Yeah, or that's just called getting a job in the game industry.
Yeah, right.
The other point I was going to make, which was RTS AI is, again, not a huge big deal. One, because RTSs aren't a big deal anymore, but two, even when it was, people that wasn't the place the developers wanted to put the most time in. But one thing they did do, and I'm pretty sure this is probably common across other games, is instead, so they came to the point where it was like, okay, so we obviously cannot make a strategic AI in StarCraft that will be able to be better than the players at what they do. Um, and even at the max difficulty, and even mechanics don't seem to be enough. Players can overcome imperfect mechanics with better strategy. And so what they did to make some sounds of challenge for the players is to give you the option to basically have the AI cheat. So there's like this maximum level of humanness we can get it to, and then instead of making it more human to simulate humanness, we make it cheat to like simulating humanness.
To simulate difficulty. Like
Yeah,
they
there we go. That was a
lost.
stupid sentence.
I feel like
Uh,
they lost sight of, or maybe they didn't lose sight of it, but like it's another example where the abstraction sort of it causes problems where
yeah,
you want it to feel to the player like they're playing against another human, but
right,
part of playing
Mhm.
against another human is that it's difficult because they're
right,
also thinking and adapting, and so they instead of being able to simulate humanness, they just shoot for difficulty, where
right,
it's like, okay,
right.
well at least we'll make it a challenge since we can't make it seem human.
One example of that that's really frustrating to me is like Skyrim, where if you like up the difficulty to
Hmm.
legendary, like the enemies don't actually get smarter or like play differently. They just have like 500%
Yeah,
Right.
health.
yeah,
And it's like you're artificially making the game difficult, and it's not even actually that like you don't change a
yeah.
whole lot about like I don't know, it's just a poor example, I think, of like actually increasing
Totally.
difficulty. It's just upping these numbers. They don't actually increase any
That's what I
intelligence
think
really.
about for like Halo too, right? The like playing legendary on Halo is the same exact thing. Nothing changes about the game at all, other than just the obscene levels of health that enemies have and how little health you have. And
Right.
what annoys me about that is actually, oh, dude, this would be a good one. Maybe we could do this next week. Just difficulty in games and that whole structure. The thing that annoys me about legendary is the fact that like it's basically you have to. You're not playing Halo anymore. You're playing a different game. You're having to learn how to play an entirely new set of encounters,
Hmm.
which is fine. And people like hold like beating legendary in the Halo games like, wow, you must be really good at Halo. And it's like, no, you just learned how to play this version of the game. Like
Right.
you might actually not be
Hmm.
that good at Halo at all. You figured out how to utilize like super low, and of course there's like it's not that simple. There's levels of you probably need good mechanics to be able to get through some of those encounters, but like
Yeah.
it's a different game. You're not even and same thing with Skyrim, right? Like you're
Yeah.
learning how to use all your abilities way differently than they probably even were intended to be used.
And even with probably some level of like
Oh,
cheese,
totally, yeah,
like
yeah. You're just abusing the
like
systems as best you can.
you're not just getting better,
Totally,
like you can't get good enough to kill 500%
right.
health. It
Right.
just like isn't
I
how
You
it
just
think
have
works.
to kind of solve the game and reduce it down to its most broken state, which is like not fun. At least for me.
no.
I get people
Yeah.
do it, so
No, yeah, I mean, I think when you reduce increasing difficulty down to just like increasing health or just giving enemies ridiculously powerful weapons that they wouldn't normally have, then
right.
you do sort of force the player to think about, okay, well, what can I do that's sort of like broken and gives me an
Yeah,
unfair
sure.
advantage they're left with because they can't actually compete with what you're throwing at them.
Yeah,
Um, and the game, as you mentioned, doesn't play any different mechanically. Like an elite isn't going to do anything different. It's just when he does it, it's going to hurt me 500% more.
right,
Um,
right.
it can create kind of a slower experience if everybody's got more health and all you did was up the health. Like
Yeah,
all that happens is the game advances at a slower pace because my gun does the same amount of damage. So like even if I'm sick good, like I'm still going to take
yeah,
5 times as long to kill this grunt as I normally would or this
yeah.
elite.
And that's. I'm trying to think of games that don't. I mean, the alternative what we're talking about right, is making like higher difficulty, making enemies smarter or more difficult, or obviously there's got to be some level of gimping the character a little bit to make something more difficult. And I think that's reasonable, but like trying to think of a good example of a game with a difficulty system that is more about less just tweaking numbers and more about like changing the way enemies behave.
Well, it's
Hmm.
interesting. I think Bayonetta, which I don't think either of you have played, but
No,
that does a good job at increasing difficulty as you advance in the levels. And you'll see enemies unveil like certain special moves at lower difficulties, but they'll do it like once, or they'll do it like, at that, usually there's a point a lot of times when you're fighting a big bad that when it gets
right,
down to lower health, it starts to sort of rage and it does these more advanced attacks.
right,
And at the higher difficulties, it just goes all in with those. And so you've already learned these attacks. You already know that they are capable of them, but now you're
yeah,
seeing them all the time. And I think
yeah,
that's a cool example of like you didn't just make this
Hmm.
this character arbitrarily harder by increasing their
Right,
health or
more
armor.
deadly.
Like you're just giving them more access to their full repertoire of moves. Like they can
Yeah.
do more of what they're already capable of doing.
Yeah, just introduce more variables into the. I mean, that I was actually when you were talking about that, that made me think of World of Warcraft and raid mechanics, right? Where you have different difficulties of raid, and in general, the different difficulties are just stat, squishes, or not stat squishes. Sorry, the opposite of that, which are just making things harder, more health.
Right.
But there's one level of raid, and I don't play World of Warcraft, but I'm really interested in Blizzard stuff, so I keep up with it. But in general, there'll be sometimes on different encounters where you'll have whole new phases that unlock for bosses at higher difficulties. So like even on like end bosses in a raid, on the top difficulty mythic, sometimes you'll actually have a fifth. Like there's usually 4 phases of boss fight, and then and mythic there'll actually be a fifth one. So where you normally kill the boss, he actually like resurrects and gets harder again.
Huh.
Or has a new mechanic,
That's
exactly like where
cool.
you're talking about, where they'll have even within the same phases on different difficulties, they'll use different attacks or spawn more add-ons or introduce new things as opposed to just making it harder. Which I think you're right. I think that's a great solution to that kind of dilemma of difficulty is just adding more, more animations, more attacks, more variables for the enemies to use, more tools.
Yeah, that reminds me. I know we're just sort of going back and forth to different examples, but Xander, you mentioned Smash earlier, and there's actually a notorious balancing mechanic in the final fight of Smash, where if you get through the game without dying, the arcade mode, um, Master Hand has a friend that shows up and will help to balance the
Right.
final fight so that it doesn't
Really?
fail.
Yeah, crazy hand.
No way. Is that true? Is that where that started? Like Crazy Hand only appeared if you beat the game without
Yep.
did a perfect run.
Yep, that's where
Eh,
Crazy Hand got his start.
that's
Um,
hilarious.
he was there to to balance the game and make it harder. If it seemed like wow, okay, so you got through this whole thing without
Yeah.
dying, like let's turn up the heat a
That's
bit.
hilarious. That'd also be so terrifying as a player, especially because you're probably a kid at that point playing Super Smash Bros. And then
Oh
getting to
yeah,
the final
it was
boss and there being
terrifying.
2 of them, and then probably just getting absolutely murdered.
Yeah,
Yep.
I love that idea of like, yeah, just in general, the idea of making adding more like surprises or more like mechanics into like something that's really unexpected makes I think makes the player experience feel better because you don't know exactly what's coming all the
Totally.
time. And like you can't just predict the situation
Yeah.
perfectly.
And it's rewarding too. Like as you get better at this game, you get to see more of what the developers put into it.
Right. Yeah.
Like you get to see
Mhm.
more of these moves, more content. In a way, you reward a player's skill with content.
Yeah. And it gives the player a great sense of progression and power. We were talking about earlier a little bit, like we're not the gaming industry doesn't make simulators as large part. It makes games, and part of gaming is feeling good and feeling powerful and feeling successful. Um,
Right.
and one way to do that is to show kind of concrete growth in the player where you were fighting things that were doing X set of moves, and then you're fighting them that did X and Y, and you can now beat the ones that do X and Y, and that's just a very clear, easy kind of step of play progression there that you've done. The thing I was thinking about was like back to Shadows of Mordor again, which is a stealth kind of action adventure game. Um, there one thing that I was thinking about, just difficulty and scaling and AI and stuff, and that one they don't change the AI a whole lot. The AI system's pretty cool in that game actually. There's a kind of unique system in terms of the way that different enemies interact with you, but one thing they do is they basically as enemies get harder or higher level, they'll have more. One, they'll have more things like we were talking about. They'll have a different set of abilities or attacks or certain interactions. But the other thing is that they'll gain resistances to things you can do. So
Hmm.
one way to change difficulty is both introducing new abilities to overcome to the players, but also gimping the players' abilities by removing tools, which feels different to me than just straight making everything less
Mhm.
effective. Is like, no, you can't
Yes.
use this ability on this thing. Now figure out how to do it. Which that seems more like a puzzle,
Right.
and that like that encourages creativity and movement as opposed to just do this thing more. Um,
Yeah, it's a
Right.
great point. That's a great point.
which so when you get like an enemy war chief that is completely immune to all ranged stealth and like execution based attacks, which are like pretty much the main way you kill bosses in that game. Having to come up with other ways like um, using environmental things, using turning other enemies against them, which is something you can do.
Hmm.
Utilizing like wild animals out in the world or that
Yeah.
sort of thing. That's what that opens
And
up to.
yeah, and the beautiful thing is they build that into the game. Like they don't hide that mechanic from you.
Yeah.
Like you can interrogate grunt level enemies to figure out like what the weaknesses and defenses
Right.
are of like the commanders or whatever they're
Yeah. Yeah.
called. And so I think that that's cool too, that it's not like, oh, we're just like hiding this, like it, like you're allowed to like learn and like learn how to beat the
Yeah.
enemies, and like they tell you about the AI
Yeah. Yeah.
changes and things like
Learning's
that.
a game mechanic actually that they put in, as opposed to just like showing up and like doing a stealth kill and then it not working and then dying and being like, okay, well, let's try the next thing, and then that doesn't work and until you have to build
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point. That's another way that people who are making AI can make it more difficult for the player is by identifying the things that are really effective
Yeah.
and either putting you in situations where you can't do that,
Mhm.
like forcing you at close range with a baddie who you'd normally kill with a
Right.
sniper. Like, okay, well now you've got to deal with him at close range. Like, what are you going to
Right.
do? It's easy to snipe a hunter in Halo. It's a little different when he's smashing
Right.
your
When you're
face in.
running around a
He's big
small
gun.
arena.
Uh, and I do think that that forces the player to think more creatively and puts you on your toes in a way where you get a sense that the developers have gone before you and have identified, like, because they play test this stuff, like if this gun seems like ridiculously good at shredding a particular enemy, they can disable that gun because there's a malfunction for 10 minutes in the game,
Right.
and there's a bunch of these enemies and you've got to figure
Right.
out how to beat them without that gun, and like that's like a cool thing for the player because
Hmm.
they've got to get outside of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
I think
This made me
Survival
think of
Horror
Dead
does
Space that
this
does the exact opposite, where you have your fusion gun from
the whole
minute
time.
one, and it is always by far the best thing that you can use throughout the entire game, period. And it never
Well, it's
disables
funny
it.
you mentioned that because I was going to say I think Survival Horror does a better job at forcing the player to be creative
sure.
because you run out of
Yeah.
bullets, like you run out of ammo, you've got to switch to a different gun, and that's cool. I like that when you're forced to change up your gameplay.
Totally. And then that's the whole point of survival horror, right? Is the idea of like just making you feel desperate by not having just unlimited. I mean, that's like
Yeah.
the kind of ultimate example of that was like the Amnesia games, Amnesia Dark Descent, and then they did Machine for Pigs, and they did an expansion to Dark Descent called Jolene, I think. But anyway, point is, those games are widely considered some of the scariest games ever made. And it's interesting because it doesn't have some of the classic horror tropes of like just terrifying, disgusting, horrifying images or a whole lot of jump scares. It has neither of those. It has one
Right.
ridiculously beautiful atmospheric development, but two, the fact that you have almost nothing you can do in that game. The only
Hmm.
mechanic is light. Basically, you can light candles and then you have a lantern. And there's really basic puzzle solving mechanics of like open this door, collect this item, and put it here. But there's no like you can't. There's no combat. There's no like movement based ability. It's entirely when things go bad, you are entirely powerless. And what people found was that it was actually way more terrifying than having like tons of demons come at you like Doom, right? Like no one thinks of Doom as particularly terrifying, because even though it's
Right.
these horrifying
Hmm.
images, you are the Space Marine with the BFG where you get to just mow everything down. That feeling of powerlessness was what made it so terrifying and so scary. And it's really hard actually to convey
Yeah.
that without playing it. I remember watching videos and I was like, this doesn't look that scary. And then I tried playing it by myself and I was like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. I'm gonna go like get a sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting too. So games like Amnesia strip that from you, like from the
Right,
start. Like you never have like a pistol or a gun or
right,
anything. But even games that I think there are games that particularly I love The
yeah,
Last of Us, and I think it does this well, is that like you have control over your resources. And some of the scariest points, like you said, are when you don't have a lot of bullets or when you have no
yeah,
bullets in your but the thing is, the beautiful thing about that is that you got yourself in that place. Like you
yeah,
used your ammo. And so that's like it feels like it's on the player almost instead of like, oh, this is kind of a cheesy thing where my gun
right,
jammed up for no
yeah,
reason,
Yeah, that's
like
fair.
the game chose that. It was like, no, I chose this by using my bullets
yeah,
early or like not spending my
yeah.
resources well.
And full circle, if you play Left 4 Dead sequentially, then you actually start the next level with exactly what you had the previous level, both in terms of health, all your items, and your ammo. And a lot of times you'll have ways to be able to regain that, but um, that's another that's a great point, is that it makes you feel, one, it's a little bit more immersion as the player because you're now reaping the direct consequences of what you did. But two,
Right.
it makes you feel a lot less kind of taken advantage of by the game, right? A little bit less unfair because you're just like, nope,
Yeah.
this is the resources I had, and now here I am. So
Yeah, and that can go in your favor too. Like if you picked up a sweet weapon in the last chapter or whatever, going into the new one, you
right,
get
you
to
have
have
that
that
instead
still.
of your default just crappy pistol. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think the gun jamming example is not it's not particularly well thought out, but just
Yeah, but
popped into
something
my
like that.
head.
Yeah, totally.
But I think that when you can highlight the consequences of a player's choice, I really think that that's the bread and butter for gaming just in general.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a medium where you get to interact with choice in a way you just can't in any other medium.
exactly.
And so I think that you're spot on, Xander, when you talked about how players' choices should affect how the game plays. And like you can make the player feel like they need to use all their bullets, but I think that still once they run out of bullets, it feels different to them than,
Hmm.
oh, we're gonna just arbitrarily strip you of your gun because you got mugged and now you've got to play without a gun.
Right.
Right.
I think that it's funny. People talk like it's a big, at least maybe it's not so much as anymore, but I felt like it was uh, a few years ago, or at least pretty recently. But like trying to put like as much player choice or like freedom, like that was just a buzzword on the back of any game case, like fully immersive, like consequence based like gameplay, and that seems to be something that people strive for so much. And usually the way that looks is really crummy. It's like good choice, bad choice, and you pick the bad one, and bad things happen. You're a bad person, and you're a bad guy, and good one.
Right.
And it's like not. It's not like what you were talking about, like rewarding player choice, or at least just giving consequence to it, being in terms of the way you spend your resource, like that feels a lot more organic and a lot more meaningful and a lot more actually immersive,
Hmm.
as opposed to just these like help poor widowed woman, or like smash her head with a rock, like it's
Right,
like,
right, right.
I wonder what the game wants me to do, like obviously those are a little bit
Right.
oversimplified, but the majority of
Sure.
choice
Well,
in games feels like that.
yeah, and even that is a step up from old, like really classic, like JRPGs or stuff, where like you were given two choices, like yes or no, and if you click no or the one they didn't want, they just add another
Yeah, until you
dialogue
got
and
there.
ask the question again. And you're
Yeah.
like, okay, well, this is
Yeah,
dumb. Like,
totally. Like, why are we even?
Are you sure you want to betray your friend?
Yeah,
That could really make things
yeah,
difficult for
yeah, yeah.
you.
And then just back into a time loop of like the question gets asked again, and you're like, what? Why?
yeah,
Why are we doing this?
so there's no choice there. It's just a
Yeah, no,
facade
yeah,
of,
that's
yeah.
even worse.
Uh,
That could be good.
well, okay, well, Xander, you're going to tie this back to AI at the end here.
Yep, you are. Yep,
Yeah, I'm really reaching for the way I
yep.
can do that. But
Come on, guys, you can do it.
Well, I think we can tie it back to AI because talking about player choice, like AI is at its best when it reflects and highlights the choice of the players. Like, and that's why you can't just have an AI that is totally random and fully human and unpredictable.
Right.
But that does, of course, as we mentioned, cause problems for games that are trying to convey an experience of playing against other people. It's just sort of you can't really get around that tension because you want the AI to respond to what the player chooses to do
Yeah.
and not to their day, their home life, right? Like
Yeah,
humans have like there's more going on. When you walk up to somebody on the street and say hi to them, the way they respond doesn't actually have that much to do with you. It's not just that people respond to what's happening in that moment.
Yes.
But your
There's something
AI
to that.
doesn't have a backstory generally. Shadows of Mordor is kind of a counterexample to that.
That
But
was one of the first times that was attempted, was trying to create a narrative
Mhm.
within the AI that be able to respond differently due to what had happened to them and you in the past.
right. But I think that,
But yeah, in general.
that the purpose of AI in general is to interact and highlight player choices. I think that Left 4 Dead is a great example of this because if you as a player make a choice to split off from your team, the director is going to single you out and cause problems for you. And if you as a team don't proceed through the level at a good pace, the director is going to constantly swarm you with zombies. Just like in a real zombie apocalypse, you need to make the choice to keep moving, and you can't become complacent and stay in one spot. I think that's a great tie-in.
QED.
QED.
Stamp.
Anyway,
Yeah.
cool. All right. Well, I think that'll about wrap us up for today. Yeah, it sounds like next week we might be talking about difficulty in gaming. Xander, thanks so much for joining us for this episode, and
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a blast. I enjoyed that a lot.
I'll talk to you guys later.
As always, Seaman.
Bye,
Peace.
guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.